The war had been going on for 3 years, and Lieutenant Jake Morris was tired of running from the Krell warships that seemed to follow them everywhere they went in space, and the human colony ship called Horizon's Edge had been hit badly during their last escape attempt, and now they were falling toward a planet that their computers said was empty and lifeless. But Jake knew something was wrong because the scanners were making strange noises and showing readings that made no sense at all. And when the ship finally crashed through the purple clouds and hit the ground hard, Jake thought they were all going to die, but somehow they survived the impact, even though the ship was broken into pieces across a dark forest that seemed to glow with its own light. Jake climbed out of the broken hull and looked around at a world that should not exist because the trees were bigger than any building he had ever seen back on Earth, and they reached up into a sky that was stuck in permanent twilight with 3 moons hanging overhead like watching eyes in the air, tasted like electricity before a thunderstorm, and made his skin tingle with energy that his suit sensors could not identify or measure properly, and in the distance, he could hear sounds that might have been birds, or might have been something else entirely, and he knew they had crashed on a world that was very much alive, despite what their instruments had told them before. His crew was scattered across the crash site, and Jake started walking toward where he thought the medical bay had landed when he saw her standing in the mist between 2 massive trees, and she was like nothing he had ever seen before, because she was tall and moved with a grace that seemed almost like she was floating, and her skin had a faint glow to it, and her hair was silver like starlight, and fell down her back in waves that moved, even though there was no wind, and her eyes were the color of distant galaxies, with swirls of purple and blue that seemed to look right through him and see everything he had ever been or done. She wore armor that looked alive and flowed across her body like water made of crystal, and it covered her in strategic places, but left her arms bare to the cold air, and on her shoulder sat a small creature that looked like a cat, but was covered in black scales that reflected the world around it, like broken mirrors, and the creature had eyes that glowed red, and when it looked at Jake, he felt like it was reading his soul and judging whether he deserved to keep living or not. The woman spoke, and her voice had layers to it, like multiple people singing in harmony, and it made Jake's bones vibrate in his chest. And she said, "You trespass on sacred ground." Human, and her hand moved to a weapon at her side that looked like it was made of the same living crystal as her armor. And Jake knew he should be terrified because this woman radiated power that made the air around her shimmer and twist, and she could probably kill him with a thought, but instead of fear, all he felt was concern because he noticed that her arms were covered in small bumps, and she was shivering slightly in the cold air of the planet. Jake looked at her bare arms, and then at his own flight jacket, and without really thinking about what he was doing, he started to take it off, and the woman stopped reaching for her weapon and tilted her head to one side like she was confused, and Jake held out the olive green jacket toward her, and I said, "You are freezing," and the woman just stared at the jacket like he had offered her a live snake and the small dragon thing on. Her shoulder made a noise like breaking glass mixed with wind chimes. The woman reached out with 2 fingers and took the jacket carefully, and she said, "This is a jest," and Jake shook his head and said, "Call it whatever you want, but I am not going to watch someone freeze to death even if you are about to kill me for crashing on your planet." And the woman looked at the jacket, and then at Jake, and then at the dragon on her shoulder, and the dragon made another chiming noise, and suddenly spread its wings and launched into the air, and grew from cat-sized to bigger than a fighter jet in seconds, and Jake stumbled backward and reached for his sidearm, but the dragon just circled overhead once, and then landed behind the woman with a thud that shook the ground. The woman pulled on the jacket, and it was too big for her slender frame, and the human military patches looked absurd against her otherworldly appearance, but she pulled it close around herself, and a strange expression crossed her face, and she said, "It carries your warmth and your essence," and Jake did not know what that meant, but the dragon made an approving sound, and the woman said, "I am Calith Silverweave, and I am Crown Princess of the Ines Velshari Dominion, and Shadowfang agrees that you are not like the others who have come to our world, and perhaps you will survive the night after all." Calith turned and started walking through the forest, and Jake followed because he did not know what else to do, and she still wore his jacket, and the dragon called Shadowfang had shrunk back down to cat size and was perched on her shoulder, watching Jake with those unsettling red eyes. And as they walked, Jake noticed that other creatures were watching them from the trees, and some of them had wings, and some had scales, and all of them had an ember eye. intelligence in their eyes that made him realize these were not animals but something much more. They walked for what felt like hours, and the forest never seemed to end. And Caliph did not speak, but Jake could see that she kept touching his jacket and running her fingers over the name patch that said Morris, and once she even brought the collar up to her nose and breathed in and made a small sound of satisfaction. And Jake felt his face get hot and was glad that the strange twilight of the planet hid his embarrassment. And finally they emerged from the forest onto a cliff edge, and Jake looked up, and his mouth fell open. The city rose through the trees like something from a dream, and the trunks of the massive trees had buildings growing out of them, and platforms connected everything in a web of walkways and bridges that swayed gently in the wind, and everywhere there were lights that pulsed in patterns like heartbeats, and Jake could see people moving through the city, and they all looked like Caliph, with that same otherworldly grace and flowing hair and glowing skin, and above the city flew dragons of every size and color imaginable, and they circled and dove and breathed fire that was every color of the rainbow. Caliph watched his face, and a small smile appeared on her lips, and she said, "Welcome to Thornspire, human, and this is the last city of my people." And Jake tore his eyes away from the impossible sight, and looked at her and said, "The last city," and she nodded, and the smile disappeared, and she said, "The Krell you run from have been hunting us for a very long time, and they have destroyed every other Velshari colony, and killed most of our people, and broken the bonds we share with our dragons, and Thornspire is all that remains of an empire that once spanned 100 worlds." Jake felt his stomach drop because he had led the Krell right to them, and his ship had probably left a trail across half the galaxy, and it was only a matter of time before the enemy followed, and he started to apologize, but Caliph held up a hand and said, "Do not speak of it yet, because what is done, and you gave me warmth when you thought I might be your enemy, and that means something to my people, and Shadowfang likes you, which is rare, because he is very old, and has seen much and trusts few." The dragon chirped from inside the jacket pocket where he had apparently decided to nest, and Caliph laughed, and it sounded like bells, and she said, "He says you smell of courage and coffee and something he calls stubborn human survival instinct, and he wants to know why you would give away your only protection from the cold to someone who could destroy you with a thought." And Jake shrugged and said, "Because it seemed like the right thing to do, and also, I have seen too much death already, and I did not want to add to it by watching someone freeze when I could help." Caliph stopped walking and turned to face him fully, and in the light of the 3 moons overhead she looked both incredibly young and impossibly ancient. And she said, "In our culture, Lieutenant Morris, to wear another person's garment is to accept them into your heart circle, and it is a bond that is sacred and not given lightly. And I did not understand this when I took your jacket, but Shadowfang knew, and he accepted you on my behalf, and now we are connected, whether either of us intended it or not." Jake did not know what to say to that, and so he said nothing, and just looked at this alien princess wearing his beat-up flight jacket like it was the most precious thing in the universe, and Shadowfang poked his head out of the pocket and made a sound that might have been laughter, and Caliph smiled again and said, "Come and meet my people, Lieutenant, and let us see if we can save both our species from the darkness that hunts us." And as they walked toward the glowing city in the trees, Jake realized that his simple gesture of kindness had changed everything, and he did not know yet whether that change would save them or doom them, but either way, there was no going back now. Jake learned very quickly that the Velshari were nothing like the old stories from Earth about elves and magic, because these people were warriors first and foremost, and each one was bonded to a dragon from the moment they were born, and their souls were connected in ways that Jake could not fully understand, but could see in the way they moved together like 2 parts of one being, and everywhere he looked in the city of Thornspire, there were dragons and their riders living and working together in perfect harmony. The city itself was built into and around trees that had been growing for thousands of years, and the trunks were so wide that you could fit 10 houses inside one, and still have room left over, and the Velshari had carved rooms and halls and entire buildings into the living wood without killing the trees, and the wood had grown around their work and become part of the structures, and it all glowed with soft light that came from plants and crystals and some energy that Jake's scanners still could not identify, no matter how many times he tried to measure it. Caliph led him through walkways that swayed high above the ground, and Jake tried not to look down because the drop was enough to make his head spin. but she moved across the bridges like she was walking on solid ground, and never once seemed concerned that they might fall, and she still wore his jacket, even though they were inside the city now, and other Velshari kept staring at them as they passed, and some looked shocked, and others looked almost reverent, and one elderly woman actually bowed to Caliph, and then to Jake, which made him very uncomfortable. Jake asked why everyone was staring, and Caliph said it is because of the jacket, and what it means, and Jake said he still did not understand. And Caliph stopped walking, and turned to face him, and said, "When a Velshari accepts another's garment, it means they have opened their heart to that person completely, and it is a declaration of trust so profound that we only do it with those we would die for. And, by wearing your jacket in public, I have told all of my people that I trust you with my life, and the life of my dragon, and that is not something done lightly, especially by a princess." Jake felt his face go red, and he said he had not known, and he had just been trying to help, and Caliph smiled and said she knew that, and that was exactly why Shadowfang had approved, because Jake had given without seeking anything in return, and that kind of selfless action was rare in the universe. And the dragon had recognized it immediately, and decided Jake was worthy of being in their heart circle, even if Jake himself did not understand what that meant yet. They reached a platform that overlooked the entire city, and Jake could see his crew below being helped by Velshari healers, whose hands glowed with soft light as they touched injuries and made them close and fade, and Jake was relieved to see that his people were being cared for, and not imprisoned or worse, and Caliph said, "Your crew will be safe here because we do not punish those who crash on our world by accident, and besides, Shadowfang has claimed you, and that means your people are under our protection now." Jake asked why the Krell had never found this planet before if it was so important, and Caliph explained that the Velshari did not use technology the way humans did, and instead, they had something older and more powerful that came from the bond between rider and dragon, and that bond created energy that human machines could not measure or detect, and so to scanners and computers, the Velshari looked like ghosts, and their cities looked like empty forest, and their dragons looked like weather patterns or background radiation. Shadowfang emerged from the jacket pocket and suddenly expanded to his full size, which was massive enough to block out the sky, and his scales were black but reflected starlight, even though it was day, and his eyes held galaxies, and when he looked at Jake, the human felt very small and very young, and very much like he was being judged by something that had existed since before humans had learned to make fire. The dragon spoke directly into Jake's mind, and his voice was ancient and terrible, and somehow amused all at the same time, and he said, "Little human who gives warmth freely, my rider has claimed you through ancient custom, whether she meant to or not. And the question now is, will you dishonor her trust, or will you stand beside her when the true war comes?" And Jake swallowed hard, and asked what true war, because he thought they were already at war with the Krell. Caliph's face became grave, and she gripped his jacket tighter and said, "The Krell you flee from are merely raiders and scavengers, but they serve something worse, and something that has been hunting my people across the stars for generations, and they want our dragons because the bond between rider and Dizend. Dragon creates power that can be weaponized if you break it in the right way and force the dragon to serve without a rider, and they have been capturing Velshari and torturing them, and breaking their bonds and turning the dragons into hollow weapons that serve the darkness." Jake asked how many Velshari were left, and Caliph said, 12,000 riders, and that was all that remained of a species that once numbered in the billions. And Jake felt sick because he knew the Krell had millions of ships, billions of soldiers, and 12,000 against that kind of a force was suicide, and he asked why they did not run and find somewhere else to hide. Shadowfang's laughter shook the platform, and he said, "We have run for 100 years, boy, and every time we settle somewhere, the darkness finds us and burns our new home, and kills our people and takes our dragons, and we are tired of running, and Thornspire is where we make our stand because there is nowhere left to run to, and at least here, we can die on our own terms fighting for something that matters." Jake looked at his crew below and thought about the horizon's edge, broken in pieces across the forest, and thought about all the people who had died running from the Krell, and all the colonies that had been burned, and all the families torn apart. And he thought about this alien princess wearing his jacket, like armor, and her ancient dragon who had decided Jake was worth protecting, and he made a decision that would change everything. He said, "Then I guess it is a good thing humanity is stubborn because we are really good at surviving impossible odds, and we have been fighting the Krell for years, and we know their tactics and their weaknesses, and maybe together we can find a way to win instead of just surviving." And Kaleth stared at him like he had grown a second head, and Shadowfang made a sound that might have been approval or might have been disbelief. The dragon shrunk back down to cat size and climbed onto Jake's shoulder, which surprised him because Shadowfang usually stayed with Kaleth. And the dragon said, "You are either very brave or very stupid human, but I think perhaps you are both, and that is exactly what we need right now, because courage without wisdom gets you killed, but wisdom without courage means you were already dead and just did not know it yet." Kaleth reached out and took Jake's hand, and through the touch he felt something electric pass between them, and she said, "You would truly stand with us, even though you know we are doomed, and you could take your people and run, while the Krell are still tracking us instead of you." And Jake squeezed her hand, and said running has not worked out so well for anyone, and, besides, he was getting pretty attached to his jacket, and somebody had to stick around to get it back eventually. She laughed, and it was a real laugh this time, not the polite one she had used before, and Shadowfang purred against Jake's neck and said, "My rider is not used to humans who joke in the face of death, and I think she likes it more than she wants to admit." And Kaleth's face turned a color that might have been a blush, though it was hard to tell with her glowing skin. And she said Shadowfang was a terrible dragon, who said things he should not say, and the dragon just purred louder. They stood there on the platform watching the city below, and the dragons circling overhead, and Jake knew that the Krell would come soon because they always came, and they always found their targets eventually, and when they arrived there, would be a battle that would probably kill everyone on this planet. But for the first time in 3 years, Jake felt something other than despair. And he thought maybe that was what hope felt like, or maybe he was just being stupid. But either way, he was not going to abandon these people who had shown his crew kindness when they could have shown them death. Kaleth said there was much to discuss and plans to make, and her people needed to meet with his crew and learn what humans knew about the Krell, and Jake needed to understand more about the dragon bond and how it worked, and maybe between their two species they could find some advantage that neither had alone. And Jake agreed and followed her deeper into the city, still holding her hand, and not really knowing why, except that it felt right. Shadowfang whispered in his mind that the bond between rider and dragon was not the only bond that mattered. And sometimes, souls recognized each other across species and culture, and all the barriers that should have kept them apart. And Jake did not know what to say to that, so he just kept walking, and tried not to think about how Kaleth's hand fit perfectly in his oar, how his jacket looked like it belonged on her shoulders, or how the ancient dragon seemed to have decided Jake was part of their family now, whether he liked it or not. And somewhere high above the city, other dragons were gathering and watching, and waiting to see what would happen when humans and Velshari tried to work together for the first time in history. The War Council met in a massive chamber at the heart of Thornspire, and the room was carved from living wood that still grew and breathed around them. And the ceiling was so high that clouds formed near the top. And 12 Velshari clan leaders sat in a circle with their dragons coiled behind them. And each dragon was different in 12. Everyone, size and color and temperament, but all of them radiated power that made the air heavy and hard to breathe. And Jake stood with his crew of 300 survivors, and felt very small and very human. Kaleth sat at the high seat because she was crown princess, and she still wore Jake's jacket despite having access to all the royal garments in Thornspire. And the other clan leaders noticed and whispered among themselves, and some looked approving and others looked scandalized, but none dared to comment directly because Shadowfang sat beside her in his massive form, and the ancient dragon's opinion carried more weight than any political consideration. Commander Lisa Hayes was Jake's second in command, and she was a practical woman who had kept half the crew alive through 3 years of running from the Krell, and she stepped forward with one of their few working tablets and projected holographic schematics into the air and said, "The human ship was badly damaged, but it contained weapons technology that could be adapted, and the Velshari had something humans desperately needed, which was energy that the Krell could not track or counter. One of the clan leaders was an ancient woman named Mira Thornweaver, and her dragon storm song was nearly as old as Shadowfang, and she said, "You suggest bonding our magics, but human technology and Velshari essence have never merged, because the energies are incompatible, and it would be like trying to mix fire and water, and expecting them to become something new instead of destroying each other." Jake stepped forward and pulled out his scanner, which had been going crazy since they landed, but now, instead of just showing static, it was displaying patterns that looked almost like music, and he said something had changed because his equipment was starting to sync with the Velshari energy, and Shadowfang had been sleeping in his jacket pocket, and Kalith had been wearing the jacket, and somehow that connection was creating a bridge that their instruments could read. Shadowfang made a sound like distant thunder, and said, "The Dragon Bond recognizes the lieutenant because he gave freely without seeking power in return, and the bond wants to include him and include all the humans because their souls resonate with something the bond understands, even if their bodies are different from Velshari." Mira said that was impossible because only those born of Velthara could bond with dragons, and it had been that way for 10,000 years. And to suggest otherwise was to ignore everything they knew about how the bond worked. And Lisa challenged her and said maybe the bond was not about genetics, but about connection and trust and shared purpose, and maybe the Velshari had been isolated so long they had forgotten that possibility. A younger clan leader named Elena Starwhisper leaned forward, and her dragon Moonwing watched Jake with eyes that seemed to see through him. And Elena said the Krell break bonds through torture and dark science, and they force dragons to serve without riders and turn them into hollow weapons. But if humans could bond as well, then they could save the captured dragons and free them and give them new partners. And her eyes got wide as she realized the implications. The chamber erupted in argument, and half the clan leaders were intrigued by the possibility and half were outraged at the very suggestion that non-Velshari could share the sacred bond. And voices rose and dragons growled, and the air began to crackle with energy as tempers flared, and Jake thought they might start fighting each other before the Krell even arrived. Shadowfang suddenly roared, and the sound was so loud that it shook the entire chamber and made dust fall from the ceiling, and every voice went silent, and every dragon lowered their head in respect because Shadowfang was eldest and his word carried the weight of ages, and when he spoke, his mental voice reached every mind in the room, and he said, "Enough of this foolishness." The ancient dragon said he remembered when the first Velshari touched Dragonflame, and the two species chose each other as partners, and the bond was never about blood or genetics, but about souls willing to merge and to trust completely despite all differences, and the bond recognized true hearts, and it always had, and to claim otherwise was to insult the very foundation of what it meant to be Velshari. Shadowfang turned one massive eye on Jake, and said, "This human gave my rider warmth when he thought she was his enemy. And he stood firm when I judged him, knowing I could destroy him with a breath." And he looks at Kalith, not with desire for her power, but with respect for her person, and the bond recognizes this and wants to include him. And if the council is too blind to see that, then perhaps they deserve to die clinging to tradition while the darkness consumes them. Kalith stood, and Jake's jacket hung to her knees and looked absurd but somehow dignified, and she said the Krell would be here within the week because they had never failed to track down survivors, and Thornspire would fall just like all the other colonies unless they did something different, and they could die protecting old traditions, or they could fight using every advantage they had, including the possibility of human dragon bonds. Mira asked what would happen if the bonding failed, and Jake said, then they would fail having tried everything, which was better than dying because they were too proud to change. And there was a long silence while the clan leaders looked at each other and their dragons and considered the weight of what was being proposed. Ryan Dawnblade was a young clan leader whose dragon Suncrest was barely 50 years old. And he suddenly smiled and said he would volunteer to work with the human engineers. And if the bond could extend to humans, then they would prove it. And, one by one, other hands rose, and not all the clan leaders agreed, but enough did, and that was something. The council dissolved into smaller planning sessions, and Lisa immediately started working with Ryan and several Velshari scientists to figure out how to measure and replicate the energy patterns that Jake's scanner was picking up, and other humans began meeting. with dragon riders to learn about the bond and how it worked, and what it felt like, and whether there were any signs that might indicate compatibility. Kalith caught Jake's arm as he was leaving and said, "You realize what you have started?" And he said, "Not really," because he was just trying to help. And she said, "If this works, then humans and Velshari will be bonded forever. And the connection cannot be broken even by death, and your souls will be marked and changed and you will never be fully human again." Jake looked at the jacket she wore, and at Shadowfang who was watching them with ancient approval, and at the impossible city they were trying to save, and he said that sounded better than the alternative, and besides, he was pretty attached to that jacket and somebody had to stick around to make sure it was treated properly. Kalith laughed and it was becoming easier to make her laugh and Jake liked that, and Shadowfang made an approving sound and said the lieutenant was either growing on him or he was just getting old and sentimental, but either way, he approved of the human's stubborn refusal to give up, even when any sane person would have run away. They spent the next 3 days preparing for the bonding attempts, and Lisa set up monitoring equipment around the deepest chambers of Thornspire, where the planet's energy was strongest, and they jury-rigged their damage sensors with crystals that the Velshari provided, and the readings were chaotic at first, but gradually began to form patterns, like teaching a computer to understand music for the first time. 17 humans volunteered to attempt bonding, and 19 dragons expressed interest, and Kalith explained that dragons chose based on soul resonance, and they could sense potential for partnership in ways that even the Velshari did not fully understand, and some pairings would work, and some would not, and that was normal, even among her own people. Jake was scheduled to go first, not because he was in charge, but because Shadowfang had insisted. And when an elder dragon insisted, even princesses listened, and Jake stood in the bonding chamber, surrounded by glowing script that Kalith said was the original dragon language older than her civilization, and he waited to meet the dragon who might change his life forever. The dragon who entered was not Shadowfang but a smaller creature whose scales shifted between crimson and gold like living flame, and she was roughly the size of a horse, and she watched Jake with eyes that held depths of grief and fury, and Kalith said, "This is Ember, and she hatched only 20 years ago, and she lost her bonded rider to the Krell, and since then, she has refused all Velshari who approached her." Jake asked why him, and Kalith said Ember claimed he smelled like the jacket, and like someone who gave without taking, and like someone who might understand loss. And Jake stepped forward slowly, and said he had lost his entire family to the Krell, and that was why he was here, and why he fought. And Ember's mental voice was young and raw with pain, and she asked if he would leave her too. Jake said not by choice because he could not promise he would not die but he would never abandon her. And Ember pressed her head against his chest right over his heart, and the world exploded into sensation and colors and emotions that Jake had no words for, and he felt everything Ember had ever felt, and she felt everything he had ever been. And the bond snapped into place like coming home. Jake had never felt anything like the bond before, and it was not painful, but it was overwhelming in ways that made his previous understanding of existence seem small and limited, because suddenly he was not alone in his own head. And Ember was there as a bright, fierce presence that felt both completely foreign and instantly familiar, like finding a piece of himself he had not known was missing. And he could feel her emotions as clearly as his own, and she could feel his, and there was nowhere to hide and nothing to conceal because the bond laid everything bare. He felt her grief for her lost rider and the raw wound that death had left in her soul, and he felt her rage at the Krell who had killed so many of her kind, and he felt her desperate hope that maybe this strange human who smelled like kindness and coffee might be someone she could trust again, and in return, she felt his own losses, and his determination to protect others even at cost to himself, and his bone-deep stubbornness that refused to give up, no matter how bad things got. Lisa was watching her instruments and they lit up with synchronized patterns that looked like two heartbeats becoming one, and she said it was working, and the compatibility was higher than anything they had predicted, and Jake barely heard her because he was too busy, experiencing what it felt like to have wings he had never grown, and fire in his belly that was not his own, and a connection to the planet itself that hummed through Ember's scales and into his mind. Ember's mental voice was stronger now, and steadier, and she said, "I will never leave you, and we are fire and determination, and we will burn down those who hurt our own, and Jake laughed even though tears were streaming down his face from the sheer intensity of everything he was feeling, and he said yes, they would. And through the bond he felt Ember's fierce joy and her approval, and her acceptance of him as her new rider. Over the next 3 days, 16 more successful bonds formed, and each one was unique and different, because every human and every dragon brought their own personalities and histories and traumas to the connection, and not every pairing worked because 3 humans and 4 dragons found no resonance. And Calith said that was normal and even expected, because the bond required something specific and indefinable that either existed between 2 souls or did not. Lisa bonded with a dragon named Storm Shadow, who was a tactical genius, and whose previous rider had been a master strategist, and through their bond, Lisa could suddenly see battle formations and probability matrices in ways she never had before, and her dragon could understand human military doctrine and integrate it with Velshari combat techniques, and together they became something greater than either species alone. Kyle Chen was an engineer who had kept the Horizon's Edge running, long past when it should have died. And he bonded with Ironwing, who could manipulate metal at a molecular level. And suddenly, Kyle could shape technology with his thoughts channeled through his dragon. And Ironwing could understand human engineering principles, and together, they started designing hybrid weapons that merged both species' strengths. Sophie Grant was a medic who had saved countless lives during the long retreat from the Krell, and she bonded with a dragon called Healing Flame, whose fire could mend wounds instead of causing them. And through their bond, Sophie learned to channel dragon energy into her healing work, and Healing Flame learned human medical knowledge, and together they could save people who would have died from injuries that were beyond either species to treat alone. Each bonding created new possibilities and opened new doors, and the Velshari, who had been skeptical, began to see that maybe the humans were not so different after all, and maybe the bond really did recognize souls, rather than species. And the dragons who participated seemed almost excited by the novelty of working with beings who thought so differently from their traditional riders. Jake spent his time learning to fly with Ember, and it was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure because she could take him higher than any human aircraft and move faster than his brain could process. And the bond meant he felt everything she felt, including the joy of wind under wings and the freedom of the open sky, and she felt his wonder and his excitement, and fed off it, and pushed them both higher and faster, until they were dancing through clouds and laughing together. Calith watched from the ground, still wearing Jake's jacket, even though she had her own dragon, and did not need to participate in the training, and Shadowfang sat beside her in his cat form and purred, and said, "My rider is jealous." And Calith insisted she was not jealous. She was just concerned that the humans were learning too fast and might hurt themselves, and Shadowfang made a sound like laughter, and said, "Yes, of course, that was it." The evening before the Krell were expected to arrive, Jake and Calith stood together on a high platform, watching the new rider pairs practice aerial maneuvers, and the dragons were teaching humans how to move as one unit, and the humans were teaching dragons how to use coordinated tactics instead of individual prowess, and together they were creating something that had never existed before. Calith said, "You are changing everything," and Jake said they were changing everything together because this only worked because her people were brave enough to try something new, and she touched his jacket and said she should return it, because he would need it for the battle, and Jake said she should keep it because it looked better on her anyway, and besides, Ember kept him plenty warm now through their bond. Ember landed beside them and radiated smug satisfaction, and through the bond, Jake felt her amusement at his terrible attempt at flirting, and Calith either did not notice or was kind enough to pretend she did not. And she said the Krell would arrive at dawn, and they had 17 human dragon pairs, plus the existing 12,000 Velshari riders, and that was still not enough. Against the millions of ships that would come, Jake said the odds were terrible, but they had something the Krell did not have, which was an alliance built on trust instead of force and innovation, combined with tradition and a really stubborn belief that they were going to win somehow. And Calith smiled and said, "Stubborn seemed to be a human trait, and Jake said it had kept them alive this long, so he was not going to stop now." Shadowfang emerged from the jacket pocket where he had been sleeping and expanded to his full, massive size, and his eyes held both warmth and steel, and he said the Krell had never faced humans and Velshari fighting as one, and they broke bonds through cruelty, but could not comprehend bonds formed through freely given kindness. and Jake had changed the fate of two species with a single gesture of compassion. And now they would show the darkness what happened when light refused to go quietly. The ancient dragon looked at Jake, and then at Ember, and then at all the new pairs practicing in the sky, and said the bond was stronger than any weapon because it was built on trust and love and mutual respect, and those things could not be broken by force or fear, and the Krell were about to learn that lesson the hard way. Kaleth reached for Jake's hand, and through Ember's bond, he could feel Shadowfang's presence too, and suddenly he was connected not just to his own dragon, but to the entire network of riders and dragons preparing for battle, and he could feel their determination, and their fear and their hope all mixed together into something powerful and unstoppable. She said, "For those we have lost," and Jake added, "For those we will save." And around them, 17 human voices and 12,000 Velshari voices echoed the sentiment. And above them, dragons of every size and color began to sing in harmonies that shook the air and made the stars seem brighter. The night passed slowly, and Jake could not sleep because Ember was too excited and too nervous, and her emotions bled through the bond and kept him awake. But he did not mind because he used the time to memorize the feel of flying and the sound of dragon song and the way Kaleth looked in his jacket with Shadowfang purring in the pocket and 3 moons overhead casting everything in shades of silver and violet. Lisa found him before dawn and said the new pairs were as ready as they would ever be, and the hybrid weapons were charging, and the Velshari had taught them battle formations that would maximize their effectiveness. And Jake said that would have to be enough because ready or not the Krell were coming, and they were out of time to prepare. The sun rose slowly on Velthera Prime, and with it came the shadow of 1,000 ships that blotted out the sky, and Jake climbed onto Ember's back and felt her battle readiness like electricity in his veins and around them. Other riders mounted their dragons, and the air filled with the sound of wings and fire and determination. Kaleth flew up beside them on Shadowfang, and the ancient dragon was larger than Jake had ever seen him, and his scales seemed to drink in the light, and his eyes held the cold fire of stars being born, and she still wore the jacket, and Jake knew she would fight in it, and probably die in it, if things went badly, and somehow that made him more determined than ever to make sure she survived. The Krell ships opened fire and the battle began, and Jake discovered that everything they had prepared for was about to be tested in the only way that mattered, which was survival against impossible odds with nothing but trust and fire and the stubborn human refusal to give up. The Krell armada filled the sky like a swarm of metal insects, and their ships were all sharp angles and weapons that bristled from every surface, and the flagship was a monster that could swallow planets, and it hung in the center of the formation like a dark sun that pulled all light into itself, and Jake felt Ember's fear through the bond, but also her determination because they had come too far to give up now. 12,000 Velshari riders launched from Thornspire in a coordinated wave, and their dragons painted the sky with every color imaginable. And among them flew 17 human dragon pairs that burned with hybrid power that merged magic and technology into something the Krell had never encountered before, and Jake rode Ember into the sky, feeling her joy in flight, mixed with battle readiness, and through the bond network, he could feel every other rider's determination and fear and hope all woven together. Lisa and Stormshadow flew beside them, and her dragon was already running tactical calculations that appeared in Jake's mind through the network, and she identified weak points in the Krell formation and predicted their attack patterns, and suggested counter-movements, and Jake relayed the information to Kaleth, who spread it through the Velshari riders, and suddenly 12,000 individual fighters became one unified force that moved with purpose. Jake transmitted over both human comms and dragon sense, and said, "Remember the plan," because they were not trying to destroy the whole fleet but just the flagship. And if they could take down the command ship, the raiders would lose cohesion and scatter. And Kaleth's voice came through the network. Clear and strong, said Krell ships relied on energy shielding that human weapons could not penetrate before, but dragon fire channeled through human targeting systems created something new. The Krell opened fire, and red energy lances that had destroyed colonies and cracked warships filled the air with death, and the beams should have cut through the dragon formations like paper, but the riders danced, and they moved in patterns that seemed random, but were perfectly coordinated through the bond network. And Velshari instinct merged with human probability calculations, and ships that should have hit their targets found only empty air. Jake shouted for Ember to use full burn, and his dragon's fire erupted from her mouth, but it was not random flame because Kyle and Ironwing had attached targeting pods to her wings, and the fire struck a Krell destroyer's shield. A generator with surgical precision, and the ship's defenses failed, and it tumbled through space, defenseless and all. Across the battlefield, the same scene repeated as Dragonfire met human technology. The Krell tried to adapt because they always adapted, but they could not counter attacks that were simultaneously energy and matter and magic and science all at once, and their shields were designed for one or the other, but not both and. Dragon Riders struck with impossible accuracy, while human, tactical thinking kept them one step ahead of enemy responses. Chris Miller, who was bonded to a dragon called Quicksilver, shouted over the comms that the flagship was charging a weapon, and through the bond network, Jake felt multiple riders analyzing the energy signature, and Lisa said it was a planet killer that could crack Velthara's core, and they had maybe 5 minutes before it fired, and Kaleth asked Shadowfang if he could get them close enough to stop it. The ancient dragon's response was a roar that shook the sky, and he expanded beyond his normal massive size, and grew until he was large enough to be seen from the ground as a shadow that rivaled the flagship itself, and his mental voice boomed through the network and said, "All riders gather on me." And what happened next would be remembered in legends for generations to come. Dragons from across the battlefield broke off their attacks and flew toward Shadowfang, and the ancient dragon's back was broad enough for dozens of smaller dragons to land on, and he became a living carrier that flew straight toward Fime, the flagship, while Krell weapons battered uselessly against scales that had survived since the universe was young. And Jake felt the plan flow through the bond network, and it was too complex for words, but every rider understood it instantly. They would combine their power and use Kaleth as the focus point because she wore Jake's jacket, which represented the impossible bond between species, and through her they would channel both Velshari magic and human precision, and strike at the flagship's reactor core with everything they had, and either it would work or they would all die trying. Mira warned through the network that this could kill Kaleth because channeling that much power through one person was beyond anything their people had attempted before, and Kaleth said, "Then it does, but the Krell die first." And Jake felt her absolute certainty through the bond, and knew she meant it, and Shadowfang purred with pride in his riders' courage. They reached the flagship's hull, and Jake could see Kaleth standing on Shadowfang's head with his jacket whipping around her in the wind of their passage, and every dragon unleashed their power simultaneously, and fire, lightning and force and healing energy all flowed together, and channeled through her, and through the jacket that represented trust and kindness, and the bond that should not have been possible. The combined assault punched through the flagship's shields like they were nothing, and human engineering identified the reactor core deep in the ship's heart, and Velshari magic targeted it with absolute precision, and Kaleth screamed for those they had lost. And Jake felt Ember add their fire to the inferno, and he shouted for those they would save. And 17 human voices and 12,000 Velshari voices echoed the cry. The flagship's reactor went critical, and Jake saw the explosion start deep in the ship's core, and he knew they had seconds before the whole thing blew, and Lisa shouted for Shadowfang to move, and the ancient dragon folded his wings and dropped like a meteor toward the planet's surface, while behind them, the flagship tore itself apart in a chain reaction that turned the sky white with fire. The shockwave caught them and should have killed everyone, but Shadowfang wrapped his wings around all the riders he carried, and every dragon bent their power toward protection instead of destruction, and created a shield that held just barely long enough, and they hit the ground hard and tumbled through Thornspire's outer branches, and Jake lost his grip on Ember and fell. He felt her panic through the bond and felt her desperately trying to catch him, and then Shadowfang's claw, which was large enough to crush starships, plucked Jake from the air with impossible gentleness, and the ancient dragon said he protected those his rider claimed, and set Jake down carefully beside Kaleth, who was alive but exhausted, and the jacket was scorched and torn, but she still wore it. Above them, the Krell armada broke apart like a wave hitting rocks, because without their flagship, and without the dark presence that commanded them, the raiders had no coordination and no purpose, and they scattered in every direction. Velshari riders pursued, but not to slaughter but to capture, and to try to free any enslaved dragons the Krell might have taken. Jake said, "They won," but his voice was shaking, and Kaleth pulled him close, and said they survived, which was different, and around them, Other riders were landing and checking on each other and counting losses, and Jake saw that some dragons were wounded, and some riders were injured, but they were alive, and that was more than he had dared hope for. Mira landed nearby with Stormsong, and the old clan leader was smiling despite burns on her arms, and she said the Krell would return eventually because they always did. But now the Velshari had hope, and had allies, and had proof that the impossible could become possible if you were brave enough to try. Lisa approached with Stormshadow and said the Bond network had held under combat stress, and they could replicate this and train more humans and dragons together. And Elena suggested they build an academy here on Velthara, where both species could learn together and teach the next generation how to fight as one. Jake looked at Kalith and saw hope dawning in her eyes, and saw her grip his ruined jacket like it was the most precious thing in the universe. And she said he had started all this with a stupid gesture, and a jacket given freely to someone he thought might kill him. And Jake said it was the best stupid decision he ever made. And through the bond, he felt Ember's complete agreement. Kalith asked what happened now, and Jake said, now they rebuilt together, and when the Krell returned, they would find that humans and Velshari had become something the enemy could not break, and something new, and Kalith said a family. And Jake agreed and said yes, a family. High above Thornspire, dragons and riders circled together in the morning light, and they painted the sky with colors that represented hope and new beginnings, and the songs they sang were in harmonies that had never existed before, because they merged two species into one voice. And Jake stood with Kalith and felt Ember's presence in his mind, and Shadowfang's ancient approval, and knew that everything had changed. 3 years later, the Thornspire Academy graduated its 100th class of mixed human-dragon rider pairs, and the jacket that Jake had given Kalith was preserved in the main hall under a sign that explained how a single act of kindness had changed the fate of two species and started an alliance that would span the stars. Jake and Kalith commanded the Joint Defense Force. Together, and Ember and Shadowfang flew beside them, and every new rider received their own jacket during the bonding ceremony, as a reminder that the greatest power began with freely given compassion, and not with weapons or force or fear. The Krell Armada watched from a distance and learned something they had never understood before, which was that kindness could be more dangerous than any weapon when it was bonded with determination and forged in fire, and they saw that breaking bonds through cruelty only made you enemies, but forming bonds through trust created families that would fight to the last breath to protect each other. The war was not over because wars like this never truly ended, but for the first time in 1,000 years, the Velshari were not alone, and humans had found allies who would stand with them against the darkness, and together they faced the future not with fear but with hope and stubborn determination that refused to give up no matter how impossible the odds seemed. And somewhere in the archives of Thornspire, a recording was kept of that first moment when Jake had offered his jacket to a shivering alien princess, and neither of them had known that such a small gesture would echo across the galaxy and change everything, and prove that sometimes the most important battles were won, not with fire and fury, but with simple human kindness, freely given.